interview a bunch of elderly people. That was good. Good questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here for today's Indigenous Peoples Day celebration. Really appreciate it. And in the city of, so we're here for the city of Philomath, and I work with tribes in my day-to-day work, and to me it's really very important to recognize the importance and the ancestral ties of our Indigenous peoples to the area where we are. And it's just really important, and so I wanted to prioritize bringing in a speaker again this year. This year I was really excited and happy when Dr. Lewis volunteered to come and to speak to us upon my first invitation. He got back to me really fast, which is amazing and not always the case, so I really sincerely appreciate that. But I want us to welcome the tribal histories of the Willamette Valley. He's also a citizen of the Grand Ronde Nation, Grand Ronde, Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde Reservation, and professor faculty at OSU in anthropology. Thank you. Let's give Dr. Lewis a warm welcome.
Hi, Yamasi and Kapai. Thanks for inviting me to your city for this. It's a special day for all of us. It's the one funny thing, or one irony, is that it's a holiday for Indigenous peoples, yet I work harder today than most days of the year, because people ask me to do these kind of things, which is fine. You know, I like to get out there and talk about history and about the tribes, because I'm from this place. So I'm a member of the Grand Ronde tribe. I'm descendant of the Santiam, Takelma, and Chinook peoples of Western Oregon. So we have multiple ancestries at Grand Ronde. Upwards of 32 to 49 tribes moved to Grand Ronde back in 1856, and we came from all throughout this valley, from the Umpqua Valley, from the Roger Valley, from the Columbia, and some parts of the North Coast. And so those people have lived at the reservation since 1856 at least, and they had babies together, and so now most of us have 4 or 5 ancestries because of that. That's not really weird, so to speak. Tribes normally would have multiple ancestries. They would normally marry outside of their band or tribe, and so it was always the case that you grow up and you have like multiple languages spoken around you. People were multilingual. People knew people from pretty far away sometimes, and so that was always the case. But so the people of this valley, if you didn't know, or if you know, I'll go over it again, and then we'll do a quiz later on or something, right? So people of this valley were the Calapuyans. In this area, where it's called the Marysville, or Marys River, depending on how you term that in time, in historic time, or also called the Chimpinafu people of this area. Obviously, Marys River, Marysville is actually European type names that brought in by, I think it was a Spanish explorer on the coast that named Mary's Peak, and then that somehow got applied to the interior valleys and rivers and stuff. So the Chimpinafu people lived back in this river draw all the way back into the Coast Range, and then over into the to about where the Willamette is today. And so they're a very large, really organized tribe. Members of that tribe went to Grand Ronde. We know who they are. Probably most celebrated person from this place is a man named William Hartless. He was questioned by anthropologists and linguists back in the day, maybe 120 years ago, and he told stories about his people, about his life here, and I think the tribe has done some work with sort of understanding what village he came from here, and they figured it out. Another couple of details about this place. When I was doing some research some years ago, I found out that the tribes in the valley were first collected into what we call reserves or encampments in the valley before they were moved to Grand Ronde. So they were collected about March of 1855 on these encampments. And then around October, Joel Palmer, the Indian superintendent for the valley, for the area, for Oregon, moved quickly to move all the tribes onto the new Grand Ronde Reservation, and he placed the Marysville, the Chamathon, the Chillamilla, all at a camp here in Corvallis. They called the Corvallis encampment, and I don't know exactly where it was. Nobody really knows where that was. I figure it's either on a piece of settler property or down by the river somewhere, because usually you want like a water source and something. So, and then those people stayed there for 3 or 4 months, and then they were joined eventually by other Kalapuya peoples and Molalla peoples from the South Valley, from what's called the Eugene area today, Eugene, Springfield area, the Chafin, the Tekapa, the Mohawk band, and what's called the Winfley, and the Mountain Band of Molalla people. And those people were brought by Jacob Spores, who had a ferry down there. He walked them overland to Corvallis, and they were all collected there. Eventually, they got on a steamboat, which took them all down to Dayton, and then eventually, they got some meals, they got counted, and they went to Grand Ronde a few days later. So we have now that printed history. I wrote much of it in my book. We have another book coming out in a year or so that has more details in there than my book has. Mine just goes over some bare details. So if you want to know more about this history, about removal, about the treaties, about the tribes, the Kalapuyans especially, get a copy of the book. I notice people have some, and I'll answer your question now. If you don't have them signed, I will sign them later. That's fine. But yeah, so these people lived here for upwards of 10,000 to 16,000 years at least. We have oral histories from them, actually from the tribe here, that says they went to the top of Mary's Peak to escape the floodwaters probably from the Columbia that came down to the valley, and that's probably Missoula floods. So I think that story is 16,000 years old at least, which means that's a very long history. And so those people all survived. And if you look at all the tribes in the area, there are a lot of stories of people like on the Columbia and further east that have stories of flooding and people having to sort of survive floods, like massive floods that flooded whole valleys. And I think those are all Missoula flood stories, because I think the prediction is there was hundreds of floods. And some of the tribes in Western Washington actually had to moor their canoes on top of a mountain. They call that Mountain Tacoma, and that Tacoma mountain was refuge for them, and from there they spread out to different areas of Washington again. So that was interesting. So that's a very long, very old tribal culture. Kalapuyans are probably one of the oldest cultures in this area. I don't know if you know other tribes. Anybody know any tribes in the area?
Siletz, Warm Spring.
Siletz. Those are the present tribes. Do you know the older tribes, like the original tribes? Maybe we should do a quiz. This whole. Who can name all the different Kalapuya tribes? I know I can't, but. Tualatin, yeah. So there's also
The Stucca? No, they were not. Well,
the Stucca were Tillamook peoples. So we have the Santiam. So some of the original areas that still have these names were the original Kalapuya tribes. Santiam is a big one. It covered much of the Central Valley, probably one of the, if not the major tribes in Oregon at the time. Tualatin was a major tribe too. They were right on the edge of all the tribes that lived on the Columbia, the Multnomah and other Chinookan tribes, and they were intermarrying with them and getting a lot of wealth from that. So those people all lived in this area. They intermarried together. They had trade relations pretty far away. Kalapuyans didn't necessarily have a really good footprint on the Columbia, but they would go there with their products, whether it was camas or wapto or a deer or something, and they would trade what they had to people at places like Oregon City, nowadays called Oregon City, for things that they could get. You know, a lot of times canoes were traded, or mats, or basketry was a big thing. You know, like Klickitat basketry was really well known. And then there's stories of the Calapooians from this area getting a hold of buffalo robes and trading those to the Coos. And if you know anything about buffalo, you know there's not that many in Oregon. Well, maybe today there are a lot more, but back in the day there wasn't a lot in Oregon because they were mostly hunted out in the woodland area, and so they only existed in the historic times across the Rockies and the plains. So, so in order for Calapooians to get the robes, they would have had to get them from a tribe that had crossed over the Rockies into plains, probably like Shoshone or Nez Perce or something like that. They would absolutely cross over into plains, hunt buffalo, bring the products back. You're getting about half a continent worth of trade coming through the Columbia down into this region, into the Willamette Valley. It was really well organized. Everybody had a trade language. They could talk to each other. They're trading things up and down from literally the coast all the way down to the plains of North America. Amazing, right? And then all those people up into British Columbia also would trade down as well. So we see a lot of that happening. And that all entered into the valley here. Douglas experienced a lot of the tribes, a lot of tribal cultures. He interested in seeds and stuff and from plants. And he actually would go into tribal villages and get fed and stuff and pay them for their hospitality. He was kind of a weird soul himself because he was by himself a lot of the time and people thought he was crazy. So I think they thought he was more like almost like what we call a medicine man or shaman, because he was very odd. He was only after seeds, and they were like, "Let's leave him alone." And so he would do really odd things like go walking in the wilderness off a trail and fall down a hill and break his leg or something, and just because he was after a cone from a pine tree. And so very odd things, right? And so he was absolutely hosted by many tribes. They actually brought him back to health so he could go walking, and he wouldn't wait till to be healed all the way. He would just take off, and they would have to follow him around, make sure he didn't kill himself here at least. So yeah, the tribes were very hospitable people. At the point there, they're very hospitable people. They were very accepting. If you treated them with fairness and with your own version of hospitality, kind of in a diplomatic way, they would treat you well as well. So, and that's not what we saw with settlement necessarily. A lot of settlers kind of ignored the fact that tribes were prominent on land, were previous to them on land, ignored the fact that they had these economies, ignored the fact they had governments, they ignored the fact they had land claims, and just took over their land. And so that's what we were at today. My book actually talks about that quite a bit, this time period in the mid-19th century where their land is being taken over, and what they may have been experiencing and feeling and thinking at the time about losing all their land in a time where they actually technically owned it all, even in their U.S. law. And so they were sort of crowded out of their areas. And that necessitated among them, the Calapooians and others, actions like stealing from the farmers because they were starving. They were dying, and so they needed to survive. And so so we saw in the mid 1850s a lot of newsprint about one way to manage the Native people was to exterminate them, and the federal government wasn't willing to go that far, but they were talking about it. And so removal to the reservation of Native people, so they wouldn't be destroyed by volunteer militias and stuff. So that's kind of all of our legacy. Those of us that live here, I mean, previous society was not egalitarian at all. It was not very friendly to Native people, thought of them as closer to animals and savages than anything else. To maybe think about, what could be different, how it would be different. It's also important that our kids understand that too. I mean, I teach at OSU in Anthropology and Indigenous Studies, and most 99% of the kids that come to me, 19, 18 years old, 20 years old, have never had Native studies really in school. Even though we have curriculum, and we've had actually curriculum developed since the 1990s, it still isn't even taught in most of the school districts in Oregon. And it needs to be, because, that's part of American history. It's part of Oregon history. It's part of uh, it's actually essential to the history of a lot of sort of minority peoples in Oregon, including all the Native peoples that are members of tribes and non-members of tribes. So to not have that represented in our histories, education is a problem. We really need to know. Everybody deserves to know where the society has been, where it needs to go, so that we can make changes in the future to make it better, right? And I try to do that. I try to educate people as best I can. I reach probably like 75% of them, hopefully, and they usually say they know more after one class with me than they had in their whole school life in high school and grade school here. You have a question? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I'm happy to report that in Philomath, we have our staff going through the Department of Education modules
Good.
with our teachers about concerted effort to make sure that it's on the radar for our
Well, you're one of the few. Most school districts don't have the time or money. Teachers don't have time and money, as you know, to do this, and they're doing it mostly on their own time. It would be great if there was some sort of fund available for teachers could access to pay them for the extra time and effort they go through to learn a new curriculum. It would also be great, and I've been sort of working on this on the side, if we can get like the colleges that are certifying teachers to insist they act licensure, because they're not insisted to take ethnic studies. They don't take Native studies at all unless they do it on their own. And so one of the problems is not necessarily the curriculum. We have that. It's the ability to teach it appropriately. Unless your teachers have any kind of experience in that, they're not going to know what to say or the right things to say. They'll say the wrong thing probably, and so that's a huge problem in Oregon, and it needs to be solved. Hopefully the state does something more about that. They don't have any money right now, but maybe somebody's talked to the legislature. They're really good at making new laws. That's an important thing. But anyway, so go back to the Calapooians. I think it's an important thing that everybody knows more about them. They're the original peoples of this place. They've been here a long time. We're still here. I'm still here. So the tribes are still here. The tribes, have their own economies. They have their own government. They are recognized as some of the governments in Oregon. They have a office in the state capital. So when you say Oregon, there's not just one government in Oregon. There's 10. It's all the nine tribes and the state itself. So that's a collaboration that the tribes hope to expand upon, because we are sovereign nations too. I don't necessarily work for Ron, but I feel that as being a citizen of the tribe that we are sovereign nations. So we're actually have dual citizenship with that. So I don't know. I guess I could open up for more questions, or I could talk more. I mean, I teach classes in this, so I could probably go on for a couple months if you want me to. So.
You just mentioned something I've been thinking and questioning. You refer to yourself in the book as a tribal member, and you just refer to yourself as a tribal citizen.
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. Yeah.
I always default to the term of citizen, but do you feel like one's more accepted?
Yeah, it's becoming more accepted in like Indigenous studies to use the word citizen. So it puts the framework of your status into another light. It's a more sovereign light. I think member is almost like a club or something. And the thing is, in our tribe, we have certain ordinances we follow, and it's called tribal membership, is that ordinance. So, but I don't work there with the tribes. I have very little influence over what they do, how they write their laws and ordinances and stuff. But I hope that people are listening, and then they begin to think in a more sovereign way like that. Yeah. Sure. Yes.
This might be naive. How is the organization set up? You talked about Calapooia, and then you talked about all the facets of Calapooia. Does Calapooia cover them all? The Santiam or the Malala? How is it related?
So the Malala were a separate tribe. There was like 4 bands of them in the valley. There was called the Northern Band, the Santiam Forks Band, the Mountain Band, and then there was another band south of in the Umpqua Valley called the Southern Band. And those Molalla people had a separate language, different culture. They likely came from the eastern side of the Cascades and were moved over quite recently, probably in the last 300 years, into the foothills of the Western Cascades. They kind of shared the valley. There didn't seem to be any kind of like conflicts between them and the Calapuyans. With the Calapui people, who were much longer. We have, again, stories from them that probably go back 16,000 years of them surviving floods. So they predate, much of the environment here, and probably created much of the environment here too. The Calapuyans, their culture was based on gathering a lot of bulbs or digging bulbs from the ground, camas, wapato, doing some hunting as well, gathering acorns as well, but they likely spent more of their time digging things. There's no agriculture. The Molallas on the foothills of the Cascades would probably do more picking berries and hunting elk and stuff like that. So we have those two cultures that tended to intermarry quite a bit, but they kind of shared parts of the valley. We see the Molallas coming in almost to the Willamette at times, sharing parts of the valley with other Kalapuya bands and stuff. And in terms of all the different Kalapuya tribes and bands, some were smaller bands, like 1 or 2 villages or something, and others were larger, what we call tribes. Because what would happen is leaders in, let's say, the Santiam were very powerful. They could speak powerfully. They were good leaders, sort of natural leaders, and they would get the allegiance of other villages in their area because they were sort of natural leaders and they led really well. And so we see larger tribes develop from different bands, even though they had different names. Every village had their own name, and that's kind of how we associate them. And then every village had their own chief or leader or headman, we call it sometimes. So some of the major areas in the valley would be like Tualatin. They had a huge area in the north, the whole Tualatin Valley, down to pretty much almost to the Yamhill area, and then over to the Willamette, and then up into almost to Portland, up into what's called the Tualatin Mountains or Hills.
Did they seasonally travel, or did they stay put?
Yeah, they kind of, well, it looks like some of the Calapuyans stayed in their area more. They had a pretty vast area that a lot of times the land claims were down to the Willamette, so they had a piece of the Willamette all the way up into the hills. So they would have this vast range of environments to gather from or hunt from or whatever, fish from. And so, but there was a lot of travel. People could easily travel like up and down the Willamette, trade with the tribes, or go all the way up to the Columbia, trade with them. Like I said, one tribe at least, I'm not sure who they are, would go down to the Coos area and trade with them. So there was quite a bit of that too. And then a lot of that was only possible because of the mutual respect everybody had, and because people followed like rules of diplomacy. If you go into a strange area, even if you can speak with them, maybe you're related to some of them, you need to follow these diplomatic rules where you go meet the chief, you trade some stories and maybe some things with them. They allow you to cross over their lands, go to the next area. So that's not something a lot of settlers wanted to do or did at all. So, but the tribes did, and so they were able to get along because they were working together sort of mutually in many ways.
These wiped out a huge percentage.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I didn't really go into that much, but some people assume that the disease was like smallpox or something. There was a smallpox epidemic probably in the 1770s, and we don't know exactly how extensive it was. It was fairly extensive, but the big one for the Willamette Valley was malaria. It came around 1830 and wiped out people to the point of 95 to 97%. So there was absolutely very little natural immunity for the people that were here. So we think that there were less than 1,000 Calapuyans left after that epidemic. Really kind of a pandemic for them. So, and so we see initial population counts of around 16,000, and then there are less than 1,000 at around sometime in 1840s and stuff. And then going to the reservation, there were only 600 going to Grand Ronde in 1856. So there was a decline again with more and more settlers coming into the valley. At first, a few hundred, then tens of thousands coming in and through the valley, which brought other diseases which didn't do them any favors. Plus all the other small conflicts that would occur all the time. There wasn't much law enforcement. There was like one police officer in Oregon, one marshal, sheriff or whatever, and he was based more up in the Tualatin Valley around Oregon City, and so there wasn't a lot of control over settler actions. Yeah.
I know there's always taught in schools and is, a feature.
Sure.
But given that I think a lot of people here are either on our city council or on city committees, I guess I'm curious if you have thoughts on things that other local governments can do. Speaking for, the tribal government.
Yeah, no, I get it. I've actually done some consultation with like Washington County and stuff, and they've done some programming around their land acknowledgement statements they have. We produced that some years ago, like 3 years ago now, and through the whole process of writing these things out, had it reviewed by Grand Ronde. But I told them, well, that's always not enough. That sometimes becomes more, it's getting panned pretty broadly among most Native people now and tribes. They don't like it because it doesn't really do anything. So I suggested to Washington County, and I think they're doing some of it, that they use that as a beginning of a larger sort of program of community education about the original people of this place. So let's follow that through and do more community education and bring in speakers and bring in, talks or sponsor something at a local college or whatever. Do kids that are going through schools today that don't know anything. It's every single generation in Oregon. The majority of people don't know anything about tribal history because they never got into school. That's been a problem for 70, 80s.
Along those lines, you see the Grand Ronde flag is here hanging here in our city chambers, and John George, who was from the tribal council, actually presented the symbolism associated with the flag, and it was a gift from the tribe to the city, and a bit of education as well as that symbolism, as well as the Spirit Mountain to the city of Philomath for its farmers market. You may not know that, but when we back in COVID, when we were just trying to get that started, it was the Grand Ronde tribe that stepped up and helped us. So we're really grateful to you and to the tribe for that.
Restoration in the 1980s to tell everybody in Oregon that we're just members of the community and we support the community just like anybody else should be supporting. I think they really don't like it could be terminated at any moment, and we know that public sentiment has a lot to do with that, and it had a lot to do with termination back in the 40s and 50s, and really it's because we're kind of separated from other populations in Oregon, from the non-tribal or white towns, because of the reservation structure, the way it was. A lot of people in let's say Philomath or Corvallis or anywhere, there's really no news passing back and forth. Some people would sort of come in the valley and work, or ag, but there was not concentration on just letting everybody know through funding, through dollars that come through the casino, that we're actually a part of the community like anybody else, and we're trying to help everybody out, not just constantly taking through gaming dollars. So,
Can you speak a little bit more about termination and the restoration? Maybe not everybody's aware of what that means.
So the federal government back in the 1940s decided that through some senators, congressmen at the federal level, that they'd supported the tribes long enough, and it was costing the government something like $40 million a year, And they wanted to use that money coming out of a war situation, World War II situation, to basically fix a lot of the problems in the United States. Things like water issues and farming issues like that. So, and there was actually discussions in like January 1957 about 1957 about what they could do with that money, and they wanted to do water reclamation and stuff. And so they decided to allowing the tribes at first to become equal citizens of the United States, even though there was a Citizenship Act, and give them full control of the reservations, rather than having federal government control them administratively. That turned into, that sort of notion of liquidation turned into termination. So they realized they had to first terminate the agreements, which are the treaties, and then the final termination bill that we had at Grand Ronde was not to get the land and the tribal organization, but to liquidate all the land and us to just divide the proceeds among the membership. And at that time, Grand Ronde was about 1,000 people, and so they'd been $2 a piece for their portion of that land, that reservation. So that that policy was supposed to eventually dissolve the whole Indian Affairs program in the United States, and a lot of tribes saw what was happening with the Oregon tribes, and they got together with like National Congress of American Indians, and they fought it. They got lawyers to understand what they were doing, and they were fighting it. And so a lot of tribes did get terminated because they fought it. Warm Springs, it never got terminated. Umatilla never got terminated. So a lot of the bigger tribes that had already had about almost 600 acres left by the time of termination. And so they didn't have any resources or money to fight it. And, you know, they were sort of really sold a bill of goods. They were told that they would get equal treatment, that they would get control of the reservation, and that's not at all what happened. That last termination bill they got in 53, 54, just sold the land and told them basically they had to leave. And so people went through about a decade and a half not really happy with what happened, losing the reservation, even though that reservation had been promised. They realized in the early 70s that our people were declining rapidly, the culture was going. So people at our tribe, several elders in our tribe, began talking with Oregon politicians, getting them interested in reversing termination. And we see the Siletz restored third in 1983. Between that was, I think, Cow Creek in 82, and then after that, Coos and Coquille and Philomath were restored. But everybody agreed that if that hadn't happened, our cultures would have disappeared forever. The languages would have disappeared forever, and many of them probably have disappeared forever. We're just doing what we can to preserve them right now. But yeah, so basically we were left with no resources, and we're told to sort of integrate with society. Portland or Salem, and they just joined the poorest workforce because they had no other training, and that didn't work well for a lot of people. Yeah, so that's kind of, we're coming out of that. I wrote a whole dissertation on that. If you want to know more details, it's online. But we're now in what I call the restoration period. While we were restored in 83 as a government, in 89 with land as a reservation, it took till like 94, 95 to get actually some kind of a revenue with the casino being built. And then from that, we've been gradually building a government. And it may take another 50 years to rebuild language or doing some of the culture elements like canoe culture and stuff at Grand Ronde, but there's lots of parts of the culture like the history and stuff we just don't understand yet. I'm writing it now. We're producing new stuff now. We're having to read documents, things like that. And so we're kind of in the midst of that right now. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the disease from some time ago. Most recently, we just had COVID, which affected all of us, but
Right.
I think it particularly impacted tribes, elders, and those sorts of things we want to
That's right.
elaborate on.
Right. A lot of people died. Yeah, there's been a lot of loss. I think if you start doing the studies on the lost languages around the world or even the United States, we start to see several languages basically die every year. And in that time period, a lot of elders died and a lot of language speakers died. Because the tribes were saying they were not getting the supply they needed. And tribes don't have hospitals. You know, they're separate communities. Sometimes they have they have sometimes clinics, but they're not set up to have, you know, beds and oxygen and everything else. So that's been a big problem for many tribes. Getting access to effective medical care for things like, you know, COVID was a huge problem. Yeah.
Cheers. And can you talk a little bit about
One's from Oregon. Let's talk about Oregon. The one's from
from California.
Historians have sort of reanalyzed the removal of the tribes as their own Trail of Tears, and so we have in 1856. Tribes that were being removed from southern Oregon, from Columbia, the coast, and the Grand Ronde reservations. And then we also see tribes in Columbia, further down the Columbia, going to Warm Springs. So we started to see a lot of reservations being sort of occupied at that point. And those are all, every time there's a removal of people, that's called a Trail of Tears now, because it's usually pretty extreme, and people are dying, and nobody's happy about it, or at least no Native people are happy about it. So that is the one from the Table Rock that came up through the interior, like February to March. Some people, there was a few wagons, and most people walked. And I think this talked about as 7 people dying and 7 babies being born. That's usually the story. So there was no net loss, but it was actually a very dramatic trek. There were a few attacks from settlers on the way, some tribes, and some people's spirits too. So yeah, those people were moved to Grand Ronde. I don't think anybody died on the Umpqua removal. I don't remember that. I have to go back and look at the Umpqua removal journal. That actually occurred a month before the Table Rock. After the end of the Rebel War, most of the tribes refused to surrender to the volunteer militia because they knew they would not survive, because the militia was not a very nice organization to tribes. So they instead said they would go surrender at Port Orford. And so there was a detachment of troops there. They knew they would be treated fairly by the U.S. Army. So they would go there and they would surrender their arms, and they would camp outside of the fort, so they'd be protected somewhat. And those people were removed in 3 different trips, 2 by steamboat through Port Coast. And those people that walked up the coast, they settled essentially between the Salmon River at Lincoln City and Newport by the Yakima. So there's another ones for you know, to the Mount here and other stuff, but yeah.
On the Grand Ronde, do you call it reservation still, or?
Yeah, it's a reservation. Yeah.
Do you have schools where you teach the languages to the youth?
Yeah. We have the Chinookwawa school there. I think they teach at least 4 grades. So I think it's like kindergarten to 3rd or something. And then maybe some expansion since I was there. But I know they've been building some more school buildings, so maybe they're planning to expand it more. They also have some adult education and community education. They do also teach Chinook through the Polycom system, or they used to, now it's probably Zoom, through LCC, and they teach it classes at LCC with intermediary teachers there too. But yeah, it's taught 4 grades as immersion education, so they're trying to cement that in their brain before they get old and they can't learn anything. Right? You guys know that, right? You're too old or anything. So I feel that same thing. I'm trying to learn Spanish. I've been trying to learn it for like 20 years. It's never gonna catch. So that's where we're at. So apparently kids learn languages really fast, so we can cement it in their brain by the time they're like 12 or something. They'll have it the rest of their life, or most of the rest of their life. Yeah.
So they're primarily teaching Chinookwawa?
Yeah, none of the languages being really worked on. There are some products with other languages. Back about 10 years ago when I was the director of the culture there, the language program was under my purview, and they were training members of the tribe to become teachers. And so they already had that sort of well in hand. And so one of the linguistic experts we were using, Henry Zink, is also the foremost expert on Kalapuyan languages. So, and he hadn't done anything with them, the Kalapuyan languages, in like 30 years. So I suggested he do something more with that. He's kind of getting up there in age, and there's not a lot of options for studying the linguistics of Kalapuyan. So he produced a book about Louis Conoyer. Louis Conoyer was a Tualatin tribal member back in the day, and he had talked to, I think, Melville Jacobs, an early anthropologist, and had elicited a lot of like his own personal story into these notebooks that had never been translated. So Zink and a man named Jed Schrock translated those much of those journals into a book, and now the Louis Conoyer book is out there for you to read. So.
The same meeting that we received the Grand Rum flag, the Siletz Indians also provided us one of their flags.
Yeah.
And we had Robert Panda provided some background on the symbolism associated with that. Could you talk a little bit about the intertribal relationship between the two tribes?
Well, I think culturally, there's actually a lot of relationships. Grand Ron and Siletz have worked together on canoe journeys and stuff. Grand Ron at times has been teaching people at Siletz how to make canoes, because Grand Ron people have been with people in the Columbia, and so that's been going on. There's been a lot of cross work recently with fire. So people in the cultural fire community that are trying to bring that back as a cultural practice to help sort of manage our landscapes are working together quite a bit on that. We're doing studies on Camas. We're doing studies on Wapto together. So culturally and probably scientifically, we're doing a lot together. There are a lot of familiar relations between Grand Ron and Siletz. We're almost the same people, except for they had more coastal and more sort of Rogue River type peoples in their tribe, and we have more interior valley and northern peoples in our tribe. But there's
kind of the geographic origins that are really.
Yeah, that's generalized. That's a generalized statement, but all the people of the Willamette Valley went to Grand Ronde. All the people of the Umpqua Valley, and the people that were at the Table Rock went to Grand Ronde, as well as people in the Columbia, and then parts of the Columbia, and then people that went to Siletz were pretty much all the coastal folks, as well as a good number of the Rogue Rivers that moved over there, moved there after the war, and then to basically live with their brethren. So that's pretty much how it's divided. Names like Lino and Dowd and Mercier and Hudson and lots of others. So there's lots of surnames that go back and forth because people are pretty well intermarried. It's quite a bit of that. I mean, aren't always friends. Sometimes we're at the odds politically about things, but I think that there's a lot of interaction, a lot of reason to work together on quite a few things.
Talk a little bit more about what's going on with the cultural fire keepers and what are they doing, and if they're helping the rest of the people in Oregon think about fire in a different way.
Yeah, it's funny because people at Grand Ron have been doing fire since the late '80s. So fire seems like a new thing, but we've been doing it for quite a while. Bringing it back, learning how it works. Working with the Forest Service on it, doing experiments and stuff. I came into the department after some years after the Grand Ron already been working on these things with the Willamette National Forest, and I learned quite a bit. And then I've taken a lot of what I learned, and I started talking to some of the watershed organizations like Long Tom. And Long Tom really got interested in this notion of bringing back cultural fire as a way to manage the landscape. They got a bunch of money, I think a couple $1 million together, and they actually had a big project for a couple of years to train a bunch of people, mainly Native people, on cultural fire, and that's kind of steamrolled from there. And so we see a lot of people now, mostly younger people in Oregon, are getting experience on how to safely promote cultural fires in the area, in the valley, and now we're doing projects with counties, with parks, with cities, showing folks that that cultural fire can be safe if you do it right. And I think it is a way to sort of restore landscapes back to its natural native content, as well as we're trying to show people that fire can eliminate things like catastrophic fire too, by using it appropriately, correctly. Every couple of years, going back to the same spot, you're burning up the fuels, so that there isn't a catastrophic fire that runs through that will burn like completely, because there's no fuel there. It's not going to burn a lot. So that's what we're showing people, and I think it's going to take a while for communities in Oregon to sort of understand that. Had an incident, a couple of incidents in 2020, which nearly burned down, things like places like Salem, and burned in a lot of places in the Cascades. And we understand that it's fearful, but I think that we really need to find another tool rather than just putting out fire.
We were just at the Henry Wildlife Preserve and
Sure.
what they're using for prescribed fire.
Great. Yeah, I mean, they have,
Areas.
that's great. So they need to do it probably every 2 to 3 years to make it effective. And hopefully they're doing that. Yeah.
Grand Run has a large veterans powwow.
Mhm.
Can you talk about the cultural importance of veterans in your veteran community at Grand Run?
Yeah, quite a bit of our people, just like all tribes, went into the military. A lot of times they had no other options, but they did it anyway. And we recognize them, we honor them for their service, not just protecting the United States, but actually protecting tribes, because the tribes are on U.S. land now, so they're actually protecting their tribes too. And if you didn't know it, a good percentage of the men in our tribes went to war, and World War II and World War I, and Vietnam and Korea, and it's a pretty and so the warrior mentality is pretty well honored among the tribes. That memorial actually is not just about the tribe. It's for the whole. I think it's West Valley. So people from Sheridan and other places actually add their name to that memorial too. So so that again, we're a member of the community. We're not just separate from the community. So we're a part of everything. Yeah.
Are you one of the biggest employers in your area, the Grand Ronde?
Grand Run is, yeah.
It is the biggest, isn't it? It employs more people
I
than
think
anyone
so.
else.
I don't know. In terms of like Polk and Yamhill County, I don't know who would be bigger. Maybe the county. I don't know. I think there's 500 or so positions at the tribe, and same thing at the casino. So I don't know if you can count them together because the casino is a separate organization, business. But collectively, I think they have over 1,000 people.
And the meaning of dependent sovereign nation is,
Sure, yeah.
and how that would hold you back economically from development.
Well, economically, it's a pretty significant problem. I don't know if you guys know much about U.S. federal law in terms of the Trade Intercourse Acts, but they were passed initially in the 1780s, and I talk about this in my class all the time, so I'm ready for you. So, what is the reason for the federal government in the first place? Why do we have one? You ever thought about that? So from my understanding, one of the first reasons for the federal government is to get the states to get along with each other. And so what the federal government does is it intermediates between all these issues like laws and economic policies and everything, treaties, all that stuff. And so, and back in the day, before the federal government was a thing, the states were at different prices. They wouldn't allow people to go, have free travel. There was lots of sort of infighting among them, and so it looked like there were going to be a bunch of Baltic states or something. And then the federal government came along and they said, wait a minute, we're all going to get along now. We're all going to live under one law. And in the process of doing that, they passed this thing called Trade Intercourse Acts, which regulates trade between the states or across any border, between states, across all states, between a state and another country, between a reservation and the state. Because that reservation land also has a border, because inside of the border of the reservation is federal property. And as you know, if you've been to a military base, you have taxes at a military base? The PX? No. Same thing at the tribe. It's federal property. There's no taxes there, unless somehow you allow the state in. So, so that's a border. That's another sort of like state international border. So that Trade and Intercourse Act says that tribes are not allowed to trade beyond their borders with the state or with the federal government unless they have an act or a law passed by Congress to allow them to do that. And many tribes have gone through that process. That can take 40, 50, 60 years to do. And some tribes got that right because they had a lot of resources and they could throw a lot of money at that and got it done fast. Tribes like Osage, Klamath, Menominee, and others like that had these laws passed that allowed them to trade oil or timber or whatever it is beyond their borders because, you know, the Osage were oil rich and they could like sell it pretty easily to the new market that was forming with automobiles. So, those Trade and Intercourse Acts have been passed, and changes have been passed, you know, throughout, you know, the history of U.S. law. But the big changes happened in the 1830s, 1834, I think. Mention and tribal reservations as well, essentially. And then there's also a thing called the Indian Intercourse Act too, which is kind of expands that quite a bit. So tribes don't have a lot of freedom in terms of creating an industry and selling their products off the reservation. I mean, the tribal or stuff, but the government itself can't do that unless there's a law passed. And so that's why the Native American Gaming Act was passed in around 1990, 89, 90, something like that. And that allowed all tribes anywhere in the U.S. to have a understanding with the state to have a casino on their reservation property or on reservation land, and then sell. And basically, that's managed by the Trade and Intercourse Act. So anybody that comes into the casino on that land, they can game. So there you go. So economically, that's kind of the limitations. There's been lots of tribes that have tried other industries and they have waited a whole long time to get those things going, and it just takes a long time for it to happen. I think one of the most successful has been the Klamath. They had 1 million acres of ponderosa pine at one point with their Klamath reservation, and they had several different sawmills running. We're selling lumber off the reservation in a big way, and we're one of the richest people on the face of the earth at one point. And the government saw that, and they said, "We don't think you need to have that all that. We're going to take it away and terminate you." That's kind of the story behind Klamath.
This termination worked when many of the approvals weren't even ratified.
Actually, all the treaties that were ratified were being terminated. There were a number of treaties that, you're right, were not ratified, and those are not the ones they went after. You know, they went after, like in Western Oregon, we have 7 ratified treaties, 6 of them which actually transfer land, or did transfer land to the U.S. So that's what they're going after. There's another something like 19 or 20 treaties that were never ratified for the same area of Western Oregon. Yeah, they didn't even touch them. Yeah.
What's the current enrollment?
I think Grand Ron's over 6,000. I'm not sure about Siletz. I think they're at least 4,000 to 5,000. Yeah.
So is the Coast Reservation, that was never ratified, right?
The Coast Treaty was never
The Coast
ratified.
Treaty.
The reservation actually was created early in 1855. So a lot of people have said that the Coast Treaty created the Coast Reservation, but that's not true because the treaty was never ratified. So, yeah.
So that coastal land is kind of in a weird legal gray area still? Is that?
In many ways. I think if you talk to the Coos and Coquel, they would say, yeah, that's very weird. Coos especially have been challenged to get their land back or get paid for the land. I think they sued the government in the 1980s and got some settled land, like the whole North Coast. I don't know if the Tillamook's were appropriately paid. We have to look back at the what's called union claims lawsuits, see who was appropriately paid, who was not. Yeah, I don't know about all the southern tribes either, who was included and who was not. Yeah, there's some gray areas in there. The Coostal actually lost their first lawsuit in the 1930s. They had oral testimony, more than I've ever seen for a case, and they still lost. Testimony about where they all lived, and it was just crazy they lost. And they had to sort of re-sue later on. There's something else.
Are there any other cultural practices besides cultural fire that are used by the tribe?
Well, don't over harvest. Maybe that's a good one. Grand Ronde has a policy of selective harvesting, not clear cutting. So that could be something that people look at. I don't know if that's a necessarily tribal thing. I've heard of that in other areas too, but I think that anything that works to not destroy a whole ecosystem and works to preserve it in perpetuity would be better than what we have now. Clear cutting destroys whole ecosystems.
No historical practices, though, right?
Well, Grand Ronde people began logging with Collins Inn loggers. Like we have 4 or 5 generations of loggers in some families. So, but that was at that time really one of the only places they get a good job. Oregon, wood was like oil. It was really well paid here for a long time, and Native people were thought to be sort of natural loggers in some way. So
How did they interact with the federal and the state
the tribe?
systems, in terms of?
For a while, when Grand Ronde was restored, like its reservation back, there was 9,811 acres. They only got that land back because they agreed to allow the federal government to manage the timber sales for like 20 years from logging companies that said that if Grand Ronde is restored, it's going to somehow destroy logging in the coast. They also said that about hunting and fishing, but that didn't happen either. But so for 20 years, like 10% of the money every year went to the federal government just to sign documents. And then they got about 10 years ago, they got the right to manage their own sales because they'd been doing it well anyway. So Grand Ronde has this sort of selective logging practice on its own land. They have a lot of equipment. They can run their own company. They want to. They don't have a sawmill, I don't think, but they do it all themselves. And the federal government has really not much say. They're allowed to manage their own sales.
Oregon City didn't they just buy Grand Ronde, bought something in Oregon City, right?
The
river there.
The paper mill.
Yeah, what are they gonna do with? I'm curious.
Well, the plan has been. I was actually on many committees down there when they were working on that as a plan before it was all sold and everything. 10, 15 years ago, and the plan is to work with the county and the city to develop it into a tourism location. And then, so they're tearing out some anyway, and then they're probably gonna build back a cultural/tourism hub where people can get access to the falls in some way and hear the stories, and then the tribes can actually practice their culture. They did that because they were getting pushback from other tribes for accessing the falls, because Grand Ronde, like we've talked about, doesn't have fishing rights. That was lost in restoration, not in termination. And so the other tribes, like in Eastern Oregon, do have fishing in their treaties, and so they've been exploiting that and saying, well, we used to go to Willamette Falls, and so that's our usual place. So they've been pushing back at Grand Ronde, that's claiming the falls as their own, because essentially a good portion of our tribe actually came from there, from the village right there. So there's a good reason why we claim it. So Grand Ronde was getting pushed back, and then at one point PG&E wouldn't allow us to cross their property to get to the falls and do some fishing. The big property that was there for like 20 million, and we're working on taking care of the pollution there and taking the cement out of the water and stuff like that, so that we can restore it in some way. So it is economic at some level, but it's also cultural, and it's part of our sovereignty. Important places that are hugely important through time, even important today to a lot of people.
I have time for just maybe one more question or?
Yeah.
Yeah, one more question if you have. Well, let's give Dr. Lewis a warm. Thank you, and I know you have, I forgot my book in my house, but you have some books that might be interesting.
Yeah, I have books. I didn't bring them in because I didn't know what you guys would be doing here, but I have books if you want them. I can bring a few in. If you have books, I can sign them.
What's the cost?
They're 25. How many books? How many do you want? One?